Israeli airstrikes once again plunged the Gaza Strip into a renewed cycle of fear, devastation, and deep uncertainty, brutally exposing how fragile and unreliable the ceasefire has become for a civilian population that has already endured months of relentless bombardment, mass displacement, hunger, disease, and psychological trauma. As at least 13 Palestinians were killed in a series of coordinated attacks that struck southern, central, and northern Gaza within a short span of time, shattering any lingering sense of safety and reinforcing the grim reality that nowhere inside the besieged enclave can truly be considered secure, with one of the deadliest and most emotionally harrowing incidents unfolding in the western area of Khan Yunis, where an Israeli airstrike directly hit a tent, sheltering displaced families, killing 4 civilians instantly and injuring several others, including women and children who had already been uprooted from their homes earlier in the conflict and were living in makeshift conditions after fleeing previous waves of violence. A moment that tragically encapsulated Gaza's displacement crisis, in which civilians are repeatedly forced to escape destruction, only to be overtaken by it again, as tents intended to provide minimal shelter from the elements are transformed into sites of death, while additional Israeli strikes east of Khan Yunis, near areas described by the Israeli military as operational zones, claimed more lives, highlighting the increasingly blurred boundaries between military objectives and civilian existence in one of the most densely populated territories in the world, where sealed borders, constant aerial surveillance, and the absence of functioning safe corridors leave residents with nowhere to flee when airstrikes begin. As the violence spread northward to Jabalia, where another airstrike struck a school that had been converted into a shelter for displaced families, killing at least 1 person and injuring others, deepening the sense of despair, betrayal, and hopelessness among civilians who believe that schools or unaffiliated facilities might offer some degree of protection under international norms, only to learn once again that even these spaces are vulnerable. While another strike in central Gaza near Deir al-Balah targeted a tent encampment, killing yet another civilian and pushing the death toll to 13, according to Palestinian health officials, who warned that the number could still rise as rescue teams struggled to reach certain locations due to destroyed roads, fuel shortages, collapsed communications, the presence of drones overhead, and the constant fear of secondary strikes that often follow initial bombardments. Of this taking place against the backdrop of a ceasefire that was intended to provide a pause in fighting, allow humanitarian aid to reach those in desperate need, enable hospitals to recover from months of strain, and give exhausted civilians a brief moment of relief from constant terror, but which instead now appears largely symbolic as explosions once again dominate daily life, undermining trust and deepening anger among a population that has learned through painful experience that ceasefires in Gaza often function as temporary interruptions rather than genuine steps toward lasting peace. As hospitals already operating on the edge of collapse were once again overwhelmed by casualties, doctors and nurses forced to treat the wounded with minimal medical supplies, limited anesthesia, and unreliable electricity, performing complex surgeries under extreme pressure while generators ran dangerously. Low on fuel and essential medicines became increasingly scarce as grieving families searched through rubble, collapsed tents, and debris for missing relatives, their mourning compounded by the constant fear that another strike could occur at any moment. Even during rescue operations, funerals, or moments of collective prayer, turning every gathering into a potential target, as Israeli officials stated that the airstrikes were conducted in response to perceived security threats and were aimed at militant targets, a justification that Palestinian authorities, eyewitnesses, and humanitarian organizations strongly disputed, arguing that the victims were overwhelmingly civilians and that the pattern of attacks reflects a broader disregard for civilian life that has characterized much of the conflict, a concern echoed by international human rights groups that have repeatedly warned that strikes on tents, schools, and civilian shelters raise serious questions under international humanitarian law, particularly regarding the principles of distinction, proportionality, and military necessity, especially in Gaza, where civilians are trapped in a sealed enclave with no functioning safe zones and limited ability to evacuate. While diplomatic efforts to stabilize the ceasefire appeared increasingly strained as regional mediators worked urgently behind the scenes to prevent further escalation, facing mounting pressure from public outrage across the Middle East and beyond, where protests erupted and calls grew louder for stronger international intervention, accountability, and enforcement mechanisms capable of protecting civilians. Yet for many Gazans, such diplomatic activity feels distant and disconnected from their daily struggle to survive amid bombardment, hunger, and displacement. As each renewed strike reinforces the belief that Palestinian lives are treated as expendable within a broader geopolitical struggle shaped by military strategies, political calculations, and global power dynamics, with critics accusing Israel of using intermittent military pressure to test limits, maintain leverage, and shape negotiations rather than committing to genuine de-escalation. While Israeli leaders argue that continued force is necessary to deter threats and ensure national security, illustrating the deeply entrenched narratives, asymmetries of power, and cycles of mistrust that have long blocked any sustainable resolution. As night once again fell over Gaza and the persistent hum of drones filled the sky, serving as a chilling reminder that surveillance and the threat of sudden death never truly disappear, leaving civilians trapped in an exhausting and dehumanizing cycle of fear, displacement, mourning, and rebuilding that repeats with devastating predictability, their suffering briefly capturing global headlines before fading from attention. Even as the physical and emotional scars remain etched into destroyed neighborhoods, shattered families, mass graves, and a generation struggling to imagine a future beyond war, poverty, and trauma. As this latest wave of airstrikes stands as yet another stark illustration of how ceasefires without enforcement, accountability, and genuine political will offer little real protection to civilians on the ground, raising urgent and painful questions about how many more lives must be lost, how many more shelters must be destroyed, how many more hospitals must be overwhelmed, and how many more children must grow up amid violence and despair, before the international community moves beyond expressions of concern toward decisive, sustained action capable of ending the bloodshed, addressing the root causes of the conflict, restoring basic human dignity, and ensuring that Gaza, a civilian population, is no longer forced to pay the ultimate price for a war they did not choose, but continue to suffer every single day.